Sinners, a new vampire horror film from director Ryan Coogler, has been getting a lot of positive buzz and acclaim, but with a very provocative title and central concept. It's also a film that seems sure to inspire strong reactions from Christian audiences as well. Does it live up to the hype, or is it a film that Christians should be concerned about? I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So before the days when vampire stories had the unpleasant stigma of sparkly skinned heartthrobs and love triangles, they did occupy, I think, a very cherished position, really in both the literary and cinematic canon. I think kind of the best horror stories have always wrestled with uncomfortable truths or societal anxieties. And I'm not necessarily a massive horror guy, but I have always enjoyed the way that they often explore big themes and questions, often in I think effectively unsettling ways. I think Sinners is such a film, at least from a purely cinematic perspective. It is easy to understand why it has garnered so much positive buzz, even if I don't think it fully lives up to it. But for the most part, I think director Ryan Coogler does elevate this film to something greater than just sort of a collection of familiar genre tropes, and he introduces several provocative ideas. Although it's very sharp commentary toward religion, I think it's sexually explicit material are likely to give some Christian viewers cause for consideration. The movie begins as a Prohibition era period drama with all the action unfolding over the course of a single day and night. You have the notorious Smokestack twins, who are both played by actor Michael B. Jordan, who desire to set up a juke joint for a night of blues music and drinking and dancing. And the film's first act mostly involves sort of establishing the various interconnected relationships of all the characters who will be attending the party. That is, until some sublime blues music tears the veil between life and death and releases some vampires. Same, you just hate when that happens. And it's almost a little bit jarring, when the supernatural creatures eventually do arrive, and the story transitions into a more conventional horror flick. In fact, in some ways, the film almost becomes less interesting once sort of the earlier character drama fades more into the background, and the film veers into the more familiar territory of its horror, bloody carnage, although it does ultimately lead to a pretty wild third act. And much of this film's kind of pre-release hype is due to director Ryan Coogler being a very singular talent in Hollywood. I think on the surface, Sinners is the type of movie that has been made dozens of times before, and yet it still feels fresh, in large part thanks to Coogler's distinctive touch. Because his camera work and scene blocking are just excellent, and I think a showcase of a visionary director just operating at his highest level. The film was also shot largely with IMAX cameras, which just gives the already impressive visuals a sense of scope and grandeur beyond a typical period drama. But I think Coogler's best contribution is the synergy between the music and the visuals, which is really unlike any other horror film in recent memory. Because the film's sort of show-stopping scene, which is an extended, unbroken sequence that transports viewers on a journey really throughout the history of black music, is one of the most memorable sequences of the year. Actor Michael B. Jordan and director Ryan Coogler remain one of Hollywood's great creative pairings, and they effectively unite again here as well, with Jordan doing double duty by playing the twins, and he's just a great actor, so having multiples of him is just a treat. But here's where things I think began to get interesting, because Sinners is a film that largely lacks a clear protagonist or good guy, at least not one that I think Christian audiences will be quick to embrace, because the cast of characters are all interesting and nuanced, but consistent with the film's title, they are also all flawed and largely driven by immoral desires. I think it's an interesting creative choice that does wield somewhat mixed results. In the positive sense, in one scene you have a dispirited character who is assured that his personal sins are not the reason for the current circumstances, since they are all sinners, which is just a powerful echo of biblical truth, such as Romans 3:23. On the other hand, one of this film's sort of central premises is to subvert expectations by embracing the sinner's title as a positive. Because whereas many traditional horror films have often connected the horror elements as consequences of immoral deeds, Sinners essentially takes the opposite approach, where the unrestrained embracement of sin is the normative state, and the apparent evil is the outside forces that seek to prevent such freedom of indulgence. And in that way, the vampires largely come to represent organized religion, imposed on the black community from racist white people, with the key to their defeat being to like instead embrace a more individualistic kind of pagan spirituality, which is a theme which I'll get into a bit more in just a moment. But like as a result, like when you have like a young man who happens to be the son of a preacher have sex with a married woman, it is framed as like some sort of liberating victory over oppressive religious conventions or like restrictions, rather than being anything disgraceful. As far as kind of to consider things going on the surface of this, there is quite a bit kind of across the board. For language, there is frequent profanity, including a heavy number of F-bombs and like minor profanities, as well as racial slurs. For violence, there is some violence. It's not necessarily like over the top, but it is quite graphic at times, where you have characters who are killed and then resurrected as vampires by being like bitten, which leaves sort of wounds of gushing blood. For sexuality, this is probably where you have the most going on. There is no like explicit nudity depicted on screen, but there is plenty of other stuff. There's several like sex scenes and like sexually explicit talk. There's a man who performs oral sex on a married woman, and like you see like from her neck up, her face expressing her pleasure, and then kind of you hear her moaning from like outside of the door. In another scene, you have a woman that like seduces a man by placing her hand suggestively on the man's crotch area and like kissing his neck before they engage in a brief sexual encounter, although both are clothed. And then like in the final scene, you have a woman who straddles a man on the floor and appears to engage in sex, again, although they are both clothed. Although it is later revealed that there's like more going on to that interaction than like initially appears. As far as themes, worldview, things going on beneath the surface, I think kind of like on the surface, Sinners is like a conflict between people and vampires, but I think on like a deeper thematic level, it's really more a conflict between like two opposing different understandings of religion and spirituality. Because the film's like opening scene takes place within like a very quaint church as the congregation sings "This Little Light of Mine," but the moment is intercut with like unnerving flashes of horror, which just gives the church like an ominous connotation. I think it's like a connection that this film continues to like develop throughout the rest of its runtime. Because really all throughout, like the church and like organized religion are shown to be largely powerless, like more a force of oppression rather than of liberty. Kind of like conversely, like an individualistic kind of pagan spirituality is elevated as being a very like functional and like an ultimate good. For example, like the superstitious practice of eating garlic is shown to be like, effective to repel the vampires. But later, like when a character begins to recite Psalm 23, the vampires are actually happy to like join in with him, expressing that it brings them comfort. And so like the film's title almost becomes somewhat of like a misnomer, for like if there is no clear like religious standard to measure against, then there is no sin. And like the spirituality embraced in the film is largely one without any real like substance or like moral demand. It's a spirituality that like, seems to offer like some like ambiguous benefits, such as a man who like wears charms around his neck to keep him safe. And also like insight, where like the wisest character in the film is the one that's like most in tune with the pagan and like superstitious arts. But it's also one that allows for like sexual, promiscuity and like drunken debauchery and just like the pursuit of other like hedonistic desires, as individuals are accountable really only to themselves and their passions. Blues music also plays a very important and like I think symbolic role, because several times it is established as being important because it is music that like belongs to and like was created by the Black community rather than like originating and like being adopted or imposed upon them from the outside. And the scene that like ultimately results in the summons of the vampires begins with the performance of a blues song before the scene shifts into like a tour of Black music that kind of introduces several like anachronistic musical elements like rock and roll or tribal dancing or modern DJ music and hip hop and like even twerking. And I think like the inclusion of like an Asian character in the scene and also like kind of traditional Asian dance, I think kind of further strikes home the point. For the film, like the real like evil threat seems to be suggested like when that heritage is threatened, and notably like the initial three vampires are all white, with the vampire leader implied to have like Irish roots, and at one point remarking about how like Christian religion was introduced to, or like if you want to read between the lines, like imposed upon his country. And I think the theme is like driven home with the film's ending, in which you have like the camera cutting between a scene of a character like violently enacting vengeance upon a group of KKK members, and then also like a scene of a young Black musician choosing to resist the church in order to like follow his own path, kind of ending the film with the two prime evils of racism and religion kind of being forcefully rejected. And lastly, I think there's also the significant detail that like the vampires must be invited into the building and can't enter, on their own will. But once they do claim a victim, they become connected as some sort of like hive mind. So I think kind of in that way, the film implies that like letting the devil in is a choice, and that freedom can be found by like rejecting the external cultural advances and like brainwashed way of thinking and just staying true to your own self. So in the end, I think while it doesn't live up to the lofty hype and acclaim, there is no question that like Sinners is a well-made, if a little bit overstuffed film, offering striking visuals and I think some like subversive thematic ideas for audiences to chew on. Although from a Christian perspective, the movie obviously is a little bit murkier. Personally, I have always considered movies to be like conversations, like a dialogue between a filmmaker and their audience or like, their culture. And I try to keep like an open-minded posture of like listening to other voices and perspectives. I think kind of to that end, during a day when like many movies offer little more than just mindless spectacle, I think Sinners is a well-made film with something interesting to say, even if Christians ultimately like choose not to buy what it's selling. But hey, I would love to hear what you think. This is a movie that seems ripe to spark different opinions. So be respectful, but jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about it. If you haven't done so too, I encourage you guys subscribe to the channel, become a Collider. Got lots of other movie reviews, got a podcast, got interviews, just other fun stuff. Would love to have you guys be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide with your world for Christ.